My biography is that I was an investor in Russia. I went there for a very odd reason. My grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party in the 1930s and 40s. And so I said to myself, how can I rebel from this family of communists? And I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist. The Berlin Wall came down, and I said to myself, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe, and that's what I set out to do. And I succeeded. I became the largest foreign investor in Russia, and I started buying shares of all these big Russian companies. And it all looked very exciting and interesting until I discovered that every one of the companies that I was investing in was being robbed blind by the Russian oligarchs and corrupt officials. So to try to fight the stealing and stop the corruption, I started to expose it. I would research who was doing the stealing and then share the research with the international media. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't make me many friends in Russia. And on November 13th, 2005, I was flying back to Russia after having lived there for 10 years. I was arrested at the border. I was held in the airport detention center for 15 hours, and then I was deported and declared a threat to national security. I understood when the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly, they do with extreme prejudice, and so I evacuated my entire staff. I liquidated my portfolio, and I thought that's the end of my time in Russia. Well, it turned out to be not the end of my time in Russia, but the beginning of the worst nightmare you could ever imagine. About a year later, my office in Moscow was raided by 25 police officers. My law firm's office, the American law firm I used, was raided by 25 more police officers. And they seized the stamps, seals, and certificates to our investment holding companies. At this point, I hired a young lawyer, his name was Sergei Magnitsky, to investigate. And he discovered that the reason that they seized all of our documents was in order for a group of corrupt officials working together with organized criminals to steal $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government from the Russian government using our documents. Sergei discovered this crime. He testified against the officials involved. I publicized the people who were the wrongdoers, and we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. And several weeks after Sergei testified against the corrupt officials involved, some of the same corrupt officials arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then began to torture him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, and he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They moved him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night, and the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers and to sign a false confession to say that he had stolen the $230 million and he had done so on my instruction. Sergei was a man of incredible principle and integrity. He refused, and the torture got worse and worse and worse. After about 6 months of this, he started to develop terrible pains in his stomach. He went to the prison infirmary, and they diagnosed him as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, his jailers came to him and tried to get him to sign a false confession again. Again, he refused. In retaliation, they moved him to a prison that didn't have any medical facilities, a maximum security prison. There, his untreated pancreatitis got worse and worse and worse. He was in constant agonizing pain. He wrote 20 different requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system, and every one of his requests was either ignored or denied in writing. On the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the prison, without the medical wing, decided they didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. They put him in an ambulance to take him to a prison that had a medical wing. But when he got to that prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the next morning, and it was the most horrifying, traumatizing, heartbreaking news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he was my lawyer. He'd still be alive today. He died at the age of 37. And I could not forgive myself for having allowed him to be put in this situation, and I decided to put aside all of my other activities and devote all of my time, energy, and resources going after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And that's what I set out to do. And at first I tried to get justice inside of Russia, but it became quickly clear that there was no possibility of justice inside of Russia. They circled the wagons. Vladimir Putin personally got involved in exonerating and covering up the crime. And so when it became clear that I couldn't get justice inside of Russia, I said, how do I get justice outside of Russia? And I came up with an idea, which is that the people who killed Sergei killed him because he uncovered a financial crime in which they benefited from. And they take that money that they've stole in this particular case and many other cases like it outside of Russia, because as easily as they stole it, it could be stolen from them. And so I said to myself, I may not be able to prosecute these people for torture and murder in Russia in a foreign jurisdiction, but I can absolutely try to get a foreign jurisdiction to try to either freeze their assets or ban their travel. And so I took this idea to Washington, and I met with 2 senators there, a Democrat from Maryland named Benjamin Cardin, a Republican from Arizona, John McCain, and I said, can we freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they surprisingly said, yes, we should try. And they came up with something called the Magnitsky Act, which would do that, just that, freeze the assets and ban the travel. And in the process of, and so they introduced the Magnitsky Act, and as I started to advocate for it, I was joined by several Russian members of the opposition. A man named Boris Nemtsov, who's sadly no longer here because he was killed in 2015, and another man named Vladimir Karamurza, who is sitting somewhere in the audience, and you'll hear from him momentarily. And he and I together started to go around offices in Washington advocating for the passage of the Magnitsky Act. And this was at a time in Washington when there was no pro-Russian torture and murder lobby in the United States. And when it went for a vote, it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And it became a federal law on December 14, 2012, signed by President Obama. Vladimir Putin went out of his mind when this law was passed. In retaliation, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He made repealing the Magnitsky Act his single largest foreign policy priority, and he started going after me personally with death threats, kidnapping threats, Interpol arrest warrants, extradition requests, lawsuits, propaganda, everything he could possibly unleash against me. He thought that all this would dissuade other countries from doing the Magnitsky Act, and he thought all this would intimidate me in trying to not get other countries to do the Magnitsky Act. But I was driven by righteous anger and absolute determination for justice, and I was not going to be intimidated. And I realized that while it was great to get the United States to do a Magnitsky Act, the place where all these bad guys go is Europe. And so I then, along with Vladimir Karamurza, started going to Europe. And when I say going to Europe, we went to Brussels. We went to the European Commission. And I said to them, we need to have a Magnitsky Act in Europe. These bad guys come here. And at first they said, oh, no, that's not possible. There was too much financial interest coming to Europe. There were too many people financially benefiting from it. There was Germany getting the gas, and at the time, the UK was getting all the oligarchs' money, and here in the Netherlands, there was all sorts of business interests, and nobody wanted anything to do with it. But I kept on at it, and Vladimir kept at it, and we just kept on banging away and hammering away. And eventually, we started getting members of the European Parliament to issue resolutions and letters and support and so on and so forth. And the European Commission wanted nothing to do with this. And so when it became clear that we had some moral voice backing us from the politicians, they said, well, it may be a good idea, but it's not really for us to decide here in Brussels. You have to go to the member states. So I started going to member states along with Vladimir, and we would get parliamentarians in the member states to call on the government to do something, and then the government would say, well, it's not really for us to decide. This is for Brussels to decide. And so there I was sitting there with this catch-22, and everybody, and it just nobody wanted to do it. And in the process of all this, I met who I would describe as young, he might not consider himself young, Dutch politician, Pieter Omtzigt. And Pieter is a very special person, different than many other people I've met. He has a core of indignation when it comes to injustice, and I don't know. We haven't really discussed where it comes from, but he really dislikes injustice, and he doesn't care that much about what other people think about him if he's doing the right thing. And so he said, we're going to do something with this. We're going to make something happen. And he came up with the cleverest idea. Now, of course, at this time, the Dutch government, like the Swedish government and the German government and the French government, none of them wanted to have anything to do with the Magnitsky Act. But what I love about the Netherlands is you have so many different parties that the government is not the dominant party. It may be the dominant party, but it doesn't control all the votes. And so he came up with an idea, which is to go to Parliament and to put a resolution to Parliament calling on the government to introduce an EU Magnitsky Act. And if they don't succeed within 5 months of getting an EU Magnitsky Act, then they have to come back to the Netherlands and pass a Dutch Magnitsky Act. And the government here at the time absolutely did not want a Dutch Magnitsky Act because of all these business reasons. And so it would be easier to somehow put this into the European thing and hope for the best over there. And so they launched an EU Magnitsky Act on Pieter's initiative. And I should point out that when it went for a vote, there were a surprising number of people voting against it. At the time, it was the ruling party, the VVD, along with the far left and the far right. But with the beauty of this coalition of government, some of the coalition partners voted for it. And in fact, I think we had more than 53% voted for it, and that was enough to force the Dutch government to put this into play. And so with this thing that Pieter had come up with, it was now in play, sort of half-heartedly in play, I would say, because the Dutch government didn't want to be seen to be too tough on Russia or whatever. But once it was in play, once I went to the other countries, Sweden and so on, instead of them saying, no, we can't do it, they would say, okay, well, they half-heartedly signed on to the Dutch initiative. And so one by one, all these countries that didn't really want to do it half-heartedly signed on to the Dutch initiative, and pretty soon the Dutch initiative was gathering momentum, half-hearted momentum, but momentum nonetheless. And then with one exception, which was Hungary. Hungary didn't want to. Viktor Orban was on, is I believe, on some type of payroll, and so he was blocking it and blocking it, and he didn't care what anyone thought about him in Europe, and he continues to not care about what anyone thinks about him in Europe. But he really cared about what people, and particularly Republicans, thought about him in America. And remember, the Magnitsky Act passed 92-4 in America with some very significant Republicans. And so I went to one of the most conservative Republicans, who was one of the initial backers of the Magnitsky Act, a Republican senator from Mississippi named Senator Roger Wicker. And I told him how we almost are at success in Europe, except for Hungary is blocking it. And he said, well, that's outrageous. And he called up the Hungarian ambassador in Washington, and he said, you guys have to stop doing this, and if you don't stop, I'm going to go into a public battle with Viktor Orban over his blocking of the Magnitsky Act. And Orban really didn't want that to happen, and so the ambassador said, well, just give us a week. And a week later, the Hungary dropped their opposition to the Magnitsky Act. And one would have thought that would be it. That would be enough to get it over the line. But it just sat there, and it wasn't until Alexey Navalny was poisoned with Novichok that the EU had to do something, and that was when they passed the Magnitsky Act. Now, none of this would have ever happened without Pieter Omtzigt, and and I've been around to so many different places, and all sorts of politicians always think, well, I'm just like one member of parliament in one country. What can I do? And here you had one member of one party in one country, in a relatively small country, that was able to figure out the system and get this process moving. And for that, Peter, I'm eternally grateful for what you've done. And we have something called the Magnitsky Award, which we give out every year to honor Sergei Magnitsky, and we honor different heroes. And in the world of politics, Peter was one of our honorees for the Magnitsky Award. And what's most remarkable about this story is, and you're going to hear it in a few minutes with all the other people who are going to come up here, is that this is just one portfolio, one file. And there are many other files in which Peter had the same impact. And it pains me that Peter is leaving politics, because to have such a hero and someone so effective not in the game is a big loss. But when I was asked to come here to honor Peter, I said without even hesitation I would clear my schedule and be here no matter what, because he is a hero. What he did was historic, and whatever he decides to do next, he can check that box that he really made a difference and changed the world. Thank you.